Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to 15 with Fosca, the podcast. My guest today is Katherine Mezzacappa. Buongiorno, Katherine.
Buongiorno.
I'm so delighted to have you here. Katherine, you are an Irish writer, but you have been living in Tuscany, more specifically in Carrara, which people might know because it's famous for where Michelangelo got his marble. So not a bad place to live. And we'll talk a bit about your life here in Italy as well. You mostly write historical fiction, and you don't only write under the name Katherine Mezzacappa. You also write under the names Katie Hutton and Kate Zarrelli.
That's right.
Your latest novel, which, by the way, I see everywhere. Like it's in a ton of windows in Florence, which always makes me happy because I'm like, I know the author. The latest novel is called The Maiden of Florence, and it was published by Fairlight Books. It's out in paperback. Anyway, I'm just delighted to have you here, and I'm so happy you accepted my invitation to be on the podcast.
Likewise. Thank you, Fosca. Thank you.
Thank you. So I thought we could, well, the best place to start is, and something I often ask my guests who are based in Italy is, I'd love to know a little bit about your Italy story. So your sort of first impact with the country and why you stayed.
My very first visit to Italy was to Florence in 1974. I was 12 and I came with my mother. It was her first visit to Florence. And after that, she, with a newly minted history of art degree, she veered off into adult education, teaching history of art, and that was the rest of her life. She died in June this year.
I'm so sorry. I know. I'm sorry.
Oh, you were there, of course, when that happened. And by sheer coincidence, I was in Florence when she died, the day that I got the call to say that she died, and it was. There was a kind of beautiful circularity to that I was where she'd taken me as a child, and a place that meant a great deal to both of us. So that was my very first visit, and it was very different Florence then. Right. Nowhere near as crowded, and it just had quite a different feel to it. But I came to Italy finally to live in 2006. With my Italian husband, though we'd met in Edinburgh, because he was teaching at Edinburgh University. We had a holiday home in the Lunigiana near Fivizzano from 1993, but we moved over really for kind of quite prosaic reasons. They weren't to do with art necessarily, although it helps, Yeah. Because, the healthcare in Italy is excellent, and the state education system is excellent, or at least in northwest Tuscany, that's what we found. Although both boys have left Italy now, they're both in Ireland. So, but that was my original connection, and then as I said, it was kind of circular. I was in Italy a lot, obviously in the meantime, but to actually to live became a different experience. But it's the longest I've been anywhere in the one place.
Ah, that's fascinating. I did not know. That I did not know. So I want to know, you're a very prolific writer and you do a lot of things too. You're very encouraging of writers who are just starting out. You often write reviews, you serve on, various committees and judge the work of other writers, etc. What first drew you to writing? Have you always been a writer?
I certainly haven't always been a writer, although I knew it's something I wanted to do when I was quite small. I had an image of myself in a cottage writing, although I didn't know what I was writing other than they were stories. And it is very important to me to help other writers. And I think, the advice that I would give is always, don't leave it too late. I wasn't writing really seriously until into my 40s. And I was getting published in my 50s. And then since then, I've kind of been trying to make up for lost time, really. So, because I have 9 or 10 books out now from that 2016 onwards, when I had my first short story published. Being sensible got in the way. I don't think when I was younger that I imagined that writing could be a career, and certainly wasn't anything anybody suggested to me. But what I was a huge reader from the youngest age, and especially in my teens. So And it was often historical fiction, or it was fiction which has since become historical. What I mean by that was, as a child, I was reading Leon Garfield, Cynthia Harnett. Those sorts of authors stand out for me, especially Leon Garfield Smith, set in 18th century London, is a standout. And then in my teens, I was reading Hardy, Austen, the Brontes, George Eliot. That's what I spent time doing. I was quite introverted, and these were my friends. And I think they've a lot to do with why I became an historical novelist, because when I finally got round to doing a master's in creative writing, one of the tutors said to me that I wrote in quite an old-fashioned way. The voice was historical, if you like, and without kind of thinking about it, the book that I wrote on the course, which hasn't been published and probably shouldn't be, but these first goes at things, that was, that was an historical novel, and I didn't think twice about doing that. I do write some. The Kate Zarrelli books are contemporary, but I find them more of a challenge because they are, to put bluntly, they're just love stories, really, the romances, and they involve people who are, generally speaking, 30 or 40 years younger than me, who think differently, talk differently, do different things, have different behavior patterns. So the research for that is a bit different than it is for historical fiction. Actually, it's more difficult.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I don't know why I assumed that you had been writing forever, and this is so
Mm-mm.
inspiring to me. I also kind of put practicality before my dream for a long, long time. And so
Mm.
it's really heartening for me to hear that there is, I don't want to be dramatic and say still hope, but it's nice to hear success stories. And I mean, you read about them all the time, people who just, finally said, okay, that's it, and in their 50s
Yeah,
published their first book. But it's really nice to be speaking with someone on the podcast who is an example of that and who can be an inspiration to those of us who did get a slightly later start because we put other things first because it isn't easy to be a writer. Um,
yeah.
and it's but it's so important to hear these, people telling us, okay, but if it's something that you really want and it's something that you really believe in, absolutely go for it. So I wanted to thank you for that because personally, it means a lot to me. So thank
Oh, oh, thank you, Frost. I think it's when you get to that point, you just realize it's this. This is what I was supposed to be doing.
you. Yeah. And
It,
I
it's
mean,
it's really that. Yeah.
yeah, and it's a question of really listening to your, to your
Mm,
gut, which, sometimes we don't do because, society tells us that writing is not the most practical thing to do. And so often we
mm.
we push it aside. But if you have to do something, you can't push it aside for too long. Eventually,
That's right.
it's going to
Yeah.
come out. So I'm curious to know a little bit about your process. You do mostly write historical fiction, but it's not the only thing you write. When you begin a new book, what's usually the first spark? Is it a character? Is it an event, a place, an historical event?
Well, it could be all kinds of things. I mean, if I think back, just some examples, there is actually a book. This book being published since the Maiden of Florence, which was published in February this year in the US, but it's called The Ballad of Mary Kearney. It was written back in 2016, though, substantially, but it hasn't got proper European distribution yet, which is just crazy. Anyway, I just mentioned that one because the spark for that was a place called Gibbside, which is a house and a kind of Palladian chapel. It looks like the Villa Rotonda, near Newcastle upon Tyne in England.
Ah,
Although that book is mainly set in Ireland, and there are kind of threads that link it to things like the original story of Barry Lyndon, Thackeray's novel.
fascinating.
So that was a place, and I was in that place, and I knew some of the people that had lived there, and I thought, I know whose story needs to be told here, and it's the servant who married the Lord, but she was hidden away from his relatives. So that was where that story started. Although the story is set in Ireland, where other things pertain, it's not just the class problem; it's the religion problem, because people of different religions, both Christian but different in the Ulster context. So that was one. Lucy Dumas, which is the book that'll come out in March. It was through reading a biography of Samuel Butler. Um, the quite eccentric and certainly very original 19th century novelist, but he and his mistress and how he found her on the streets in Islington in 1871, but shared her with his friend. Yeah, which is an arrangement which her view of this hasn't been recorded. But anyway, so I've told a story about what it was like for a French woman to come to London on the promise of some other kind of future and to find herself street walking. So that was that one. Maiden of Florence, I was in the doctor's waiting room, bored, without a Kindle, without anything to read. And there was a medical journal specializing in erectile dysfunction. I've told the story, I think, before. And there was this little tiny historical column which gave the bones of the story of Giulia Albizzi and Vincenzo Gonzaga. And I thought, this I have to tell. For The Gypsy Bride, which is the first of my Katie Hutton books. I hate the title, but anyway, it's there. That's what the publisher wanted. I picked up W.H. Hudson's A Shepherd Year. That was published in, I think, 1904. And it's an American living in Wiltshire and observing the turn of the year. And there was a chapter in there called The Dark Men of the Village. And I read it. And subsequently, I learned that a lot of he said about gypsies was not accurate. But when I read that, I saw my hero walk out from amongst the trees. So it can really come from almost anything. For the Kate Zarrelli books, I used to get bored on business meetings during COVID, and I'll get into trouble if they listen to this, but they probably won't. And so I had this computer alongside my work one, and I had webcams of Venice, deserted Venice. And I watched, the dog walkers, the policemen, the rubbish cart men in this empty city as it had never been. And that's where I got the story for the plot, effectively, for a story called Coincidentally in Venice. So it can come from all kinds of things, really.
I love that you walked us through these inspirations. When I wrote the question, I don't know, I didn't even think too much about how much fun those answers could be. So thank you for that. Because some of them, the doctor's office one, I did not know.
Right. Okay. Probably
That's
one of the few people
phenomenal.
that didn't, because I tell it, it's one of my party pieces.
For
But now
some
you know it
reason,
well. That's good.
I missed that one. So I guess I want to ask you the next question, which would be, how do you think living in Italy has affected your storytelling?
We are so drenched in history here. And I think in history, I don't mean just kind of geological history, physical history, but through the creations of human beings. I mean, I live in the parish of the Duomo of Carrara, and that's, I don't know, 9 centuries old or something.
Yeah.
We have to also calculate that I know that we get annoyed with Chiusa Peristaudo and not being able to see things and stuff. It certainly used to be the case. But, 75% of Europe's artistic patrimony is here. In Italy, it's in that peninsula. And we contrast that with, let's say, the UK, where I think the historian Eamon Duffy calculated that something like 90% of artistic patrimony was destroyed between the Reformation, Henry VIII's despoiling of the monasteries, and then the iconoclasm of Cromwell, and he was using cathedrals as barracks and smashing windows and so forth, stained glass windows. And what I like here is the kind of pride that people have in this cultural wealth. I had a business meeting in Parma a few years ago, and I was there early. So I went into the Church of San Giovanni Evangelista, and the sacristan wanted to show me frescoes of Correggio that I might have missed. That you can see the cupola and everything, same as the one, not as there is in the cathedral, but there's a cupola that he's frescoed there, the dome that he's frescoed there. But there are other things he said, and he wanted to show me them. It was like he was showing, Correggio did this, and it's like Correggio's his little brother. So, I like that kind of identification that there is in Italy with and the fact that, for instance, in schools, history of art is a high school subject. It's not a kind of highbrow thing. It's a cultural thing that people would teach, the way they do teach a language. And you encounter people like Vigile Urbani who can quote Leopardi. There's a kind of rich, and it's great to live in a country where that's kind of more than an okay thing to do in a way. And also this sense that we live in a country where there's a kind of historical arc in which we occupy that space for a very short space of time. And we need to think about that. I mean, I just think about Carrara was a Roman penal colony, and the Romans were using these prisoners to quarry marble. But now we have about a century's worth of marble left. That's all. So,
Yeah.
we need to think about those kind of things.
Thank you so much. That was such an incredibly spot on read of Italy. And I think one of the things that surprises me so much, Italians are not nationalistic at all, and
Mm,
people always comment on the fact that the only time Italians are nationalistic is like when the World Cup is happening and Italy is playing or things like that.
yes,
But there is something that does join all Italians, and I really believe you've put your finger on it perfectly. It's that sense of true pride in
mm,
the culture, whether
yeah,
that be, the frescoes that you were talking about in Parma, which by the way I've seen and are wonderful, the
mm,
frescoes or cuisine or
yeah,
opera or whatever it is.
yes,
And it's something though that isn't classist,
yes,
and that's what's always fascinating is you can have a conversation with, and a random person on the street about something like art history. And,
yes,
and that definitely changes your daily experience. The first thing that you said when we got on the podcast was you talked about how art helps. It does.
yes, mm,
Beauty helps. And I think being surrounded by that as well is so inspiring, especially for somebody writing historical fiction, but not
mm,
only,
mm.
not only. So always having this sense of who we are, and where we are in this place that is so steeped in history. I really
Yes,
love that
absolutely.
observation. I love that. I want to stay on history a little bit because
Hmm.
that is your jam, if you will.
Yeah.
And um, often you do write about voices or people who have been overlooked by traditional history. What draws you to those stories and those characters? Why do you feel so compelled to tell those, to recount those previously unknown narratives?
I think, in a way, it's a kind of sense of fairness almost, because the people whose voices are ignored are predominantly female. Unless you're a kind of exception, like say Catherine the Great or somebody like that, or Elizabeth I in England, who not a person I find particularly sympathetic, certainly not from an Irish point of view. There's a poem by Bertolt Brecht, which Fragen eines lesenden Arbeiters, I think is the title. It's about the questions of a reading workman.
Hmm.
And he asks a series of questions about who built the pyramids and other marvels, because those workmen are not in the history books. And yet each one of them would have had a story. So, it's partly kind of that sort of thing. And I get annoyed because I've written 4 books, which in the canon are kind of the Katie Hutton books are what are described as sagas. And it's a bit of a derogatory term, that the idea that you write about working people. And I've heard this described as, one novelist described this as kind of a deformation of the genre, which really makes me angry, because people also have those stories to tell as well. Um, and I would never write, the kind of Philippa Gregory books where it's about the Boleyns or all the rest of it. I'm not terribly interested in that kind of thing, because apart from the fact that we know what happened, we know that Anne Boleyn lost her head,
Yeah.
end of, those kind of things. But and we do know about women who were royal or noble, but generally speaking, because their function was limited to making marriages that were dynastically advantageous. So things like that. So when I came across the story of Julia Albizzi, I was fascinated by that. When I came across an 18th century Venetian painter called Julia Lama, I was fascinated by her story, because in the intervening period, her work, of which there isn't a great deal, or at least not a great deal that's identifiable as definitely as hers, was attributed to a male colleague. So there are these kind of women that I'm interested in. I'm not rewriting history. I hope not, and I'm not an historian. I try to be accurate, obviously, because I think you owe that to your readers, and you owe that actually to your subject. But I was interested in the idea of um, the these people, these women should have had their stories told. And so I'll try to do it in my way as much as I can. So because you are talking about women who, if they were exercise any sort of power, it was probably as the abbess of a convent,
Yeah.
and that's kind of it, really.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing those stories to life and to the world because I think it is important that they're heard, and a lot of people, I think, are thankful to you for doing that. I'm curious to know, as somebody who does not write historical fiction, um, are there any rituals or creative anchors that help you drop into the world of your characters?
Um, I read a lot of what people at the time would have read. So when I was writing a novel set in the 1930s in northwest England,
Mm.
and it wasn't a crime novel, but I read all of Agatha Christie for that decade because I can get the voice of that.
Yeah.
So when I was writing a book set in 1950s Nottingham, I was reading people like Richard Hoggart, The Uses of Literacy. I was reading Geoffrey Gora, sorry, who did a survey of for a magazine he worked for of what people thought about, what they worried about, how their relationships, and they would send in all of this anonymous material, which is really quite staggering. And then, of course, things how people can tell a stranger things that they're
Yeah.
unable to tell their neighbor or their family member. There would be comments like, I'm a homosexual and I know I'm going to be lonely my whole life,
Yes.
because that was illegal.
Yeah.
Homosexual acts were illegal at the time. Things of that sort, which really, oh God. So I read a lot around that. I also do this rather peculiar thing.
Oh, let's hear it. I love this.
Well, because I have a job as well. I'm part time, or allegedly part time anyway. I work for a company in the States where we interview people for clients, and we do a kind of profile of what this person is like for the person for the company that wants to hire them. So um, there would be, let's say, an interview of 60 items or 90 items, 120 items, depending what the role was, and you would measure how people are motivated. You would measure how they approach their work. You'd measure their values. It's to kind of get a predictive picture of people. And they know at work that I do this, and they think I'm nuts, but it works. So I actually interview my imaginary characters, and I write up little reports about them to myself. So I got this little kind of profile, and I can start to see what they would do. So the character is then, as it were, influencing the plot, because I can see, he wouldn't do that, but he would do that. Now I can see why the marriage is going to collapse. Now I can see why there's going to be issues about values, or perhaps some issue that this person suddenly feels compelled to defend, and so forth. Now I know something about how they form relationships. I mean, it sounds completely bats, but it actually, I don't always do it, but it does seem to work. And it's a kind of process by which I can get into the person. So, I mean, in a way, it's not any different from. I mean, there's a Victorian novelist, George Meredith, who I think in Italy is published by Salerio in Palermo. Who have
Okay.
quite an interesting list. But he had a big garden with a summer house, and he would go in there and he would talk to his characters. He would talk aloud to them. He'd have conversations with them. Now, that in most of us don't have large gardens with summer houses to do
Yeah.
that in. And they might kind of send people around with those funny jackets you can't get your arms out of if you were to do so. But it's kind of version of that in a way. So there are things that I do to get into their world, but mostly it's reading what they would have read. For Julia, for the Maiden of Florence, I was reading medical treatises. I was reading marriage contracts. I was reading, advice to a daughter. All the kind of stuff that was there, um, uh, that would have impacted on a woman's life, even though it wouldn't have necessarily impacted on that particular woman's life, but it would have, that was the context in which she was living.
Right.
So that's the
I,
main thing I do.
I love what you do with your characters. I think it's actually, I
Thank you.
think it's brilliant and it makes total sense to me. And I didn't know that you did that. Not only as a writer, but I mean professionally, as in your other identity. But it makes total sense to me because then, of course, you get so deep into the characters and then you kind of exactly you can understand better how they're going to move, how they're going to talk, what their, what their reactions will be. So it doesn't
Yeah.
sound at all, it sounds completely spot on to me and like something I should probably be doing. But I love that. I I want to know also if there are certain themes that you find yourself returning to again and again in your writing.
Yes. Yes, there are. I mean, um, you can take somebody out of Belfast, but you can't take Belfast out of them. And that's where I'm from, a town near Belfast. I mean, I left when I was 12. I left shortly. We left shortly after the visit to Florence. In fact, that's where we were when my mother got the phone call to say, for my father to say we have a job in Scotland and we're leaving, because it really was not a great place to live in 1974. So it's the thing about love and culture clash. That one comes up again and again and again, because in Belfast, in those days, and I don't know how different it is now, but you really were not supposed to marry across the sectarian divide. And most people didn't, because it could be quite difficult if you did. And so that was one thing. So, and I see that in the books again and again. So in The Gypsy Bride, there's this man from a kind of roaming tribe, if you like, we could call them, that this gypsy encampment, and a girl in a close-knit evangelical sect, which is very grounded, teetotal, emphasized education. He, of course, is illiterate. So, there was, people with completely different backgrounds, and both their communities in arms about what they were doing. So that was one. And I wrote something called The Gypsy's Daughter, again, not a title I chose, about a young woman who won a scholarship to university in 1950s England when it was possible to do that, and who falls in love with a lathe operator in the Raleigh bicycle factory. Because, again, with the English kind of class system in particular, that isn't the kind of thing you're supposed to do. When I was at college, believe it or not, I remember a lecturer saying to us, he was supposed to be teaching a 16th century sculpture, but he at some point he said to us, none of you would marry somebody who wasn't a graduate, would you? And he kind of took that as read. And I just thought, what a peculiar thing. You marry whoever you like. So the class bit there, Annie of Ainsworth Mill is about a mixed marriage in a pit village called Cleatamore before the First World War. Cleatamore was in England, but it was a little Ireland really. And, so what happened when an Orangeman and a Catholic got together, which is actually exactly what my great-grandparents did. But that didn't come out until later. And then The Maid of Lindle Hall is about an orphan brought up in a cottage home whose employer, and she's a servant ultimately, falls in love with her, which kind of sounds like a bit rags to riches, but it wasn't actually quite that. And then The Ballad of Mary Kearney deals with the same kind of thing, a Protestant landowner committing treason, actual treason, legal treason, marrying clandestinely the daughter of one of his tenants. And that having a political transformation on him, which isn't about rags to riches, it's actually a tragedy, because there's punishment for having transgressed that kind of convention and transgressing the law. So, and I suppose, in a way, the Samuel Butler, Lucy Dumas story, I mean, she had to live life completely under the radar,
Mm.
so, and he certainly wouldn't have been talking to her with his friends. I mean, the only people he really knew about were the friend he shared her with, and his manservant, who is the source of most of the information that we have about her. So I'm quite interested in that sort of idea, that the idea that people are doing things that they're not supposed to. And in historical fiction, you've more chance to do that because there are fewer conventions now.
Exactly. Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. I love that. Is there an historical character that you kind of dream about writing about? Or a story that really intrigues you?
Oh, the problem is there are too many,
I
actually.
know, I know.
Yeah. I mean, Julia Lama, I've started to write about. I will write about her. I will write about Lucrezia Marinella, who was a 16th century feminist,
Hmm.
17th century feminist, stroke 17th century feminist in Venice. Um, I'd like to write about her. I mean, she wrote a kind of diatribe. That makes it sound very negative. She wrote a refutation of Aristotle, who fundamentally believed that women were inferior.
Mhm.
And she was a poetess and all these kind of things. So, but again, that's both in her case and the case of Julia Lama. Julia Lama became a painter because her father was a painter and she trained in his studio. Lucrezia Marinella, her father was a doctor. In fact, in The Maiden of Florence, he is he's Julia's doctor in Venice. So that's just kind of, although that's not obvious, but he's kind of slipped in there. But he saw that he had a bright child and he educated her and didn't so there didn't shortchange her on any of that. Or there's something interesting happens in her life that after she married, there's a bit where she actually goes back. She refutes some of her own arguments. And I'm really quite interested in what made her do that. So those two, I think, I've got in my sights. It means,
Okay.
I just have to go back to Venice and do some research, but you've
Well,
got to
you
do it,
do. You have you
Yeah,
have to sacrifice these things. I know.
that's
But
right. Yes.
Venice has lots of great female protagonists throughout history that
Yes.
definitely merit further investigation. I look forward to reading those, and I'll come visit you because Venice, as long as it's this time of year, as long as it's
Yeah.
okay, and
Yes,
I'll come
absolutely.
because I love Venice, but only certain times of year. So,
I'm right with you on that.
right?
Absolutely.
But it's such an inspiring city still. Notwithstanding everything, it still is one of the most miraculous places on this earth.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
want to ask you a question. I know you write a lot of different genres, but is there a genre that you haven't yet really dabbled in, but that you think you might like to try?
Well, I've kind of got into exploring writing historical crime fiction.
I was thinking that when you were talking about all the Agatha Christie you were reading, I
Yeah.
thought, I bet Catherine would be an amazing, amazing crime. I love crime in general, but historical crime fascinates me.
Well, I read quite a lot of crime and I read it for enjoyment. I don't mean I don't read other things and
Right.
enjoy them as well, but crime is kind of my sort of ah,
Me
just
too.
yeah,
They say it's a bad sign. I don't.
but I do read quite a lot of crime and I I prefer to write historical crime anyway rather than contemporary crime because I can't be doing with all the scientific stuff. I admire those who write it, but I wouldn't know where to start. So, forensics and all these kind of things.
Yeah,
So,
a lot of research.
um, so I do have a Renaissance sleuth. He's a surgeon trained in the school of Salerno. So he's influenced by Arab medicine, but he's actually Florentine. I made him the son of Tommaso Portinari of the Portinari altarpiece.
Mhm.
He was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. I mean, if you're going to steal somebody's money, or mismanage it anyway up there in Bruges. It's probably better than not the Medicis manage money that you mismanage. Anyway, but so I'm quite interested in. So I've invented this other side of the blanket son, this illegitimate son who has to learn a living, so gets sent off. And Salerno is interesting because there's the Arab influence, and in the Middle Ages, Salerno trained women to be doctors as well. It's not very clear how much doctoring they got to do afterwards because there's this line, if you like, between a male doctor can do things, but um, if a female doctor does that, then there's the kind of risk of being accused of witchcraft. He can do these things, but she can't.
Yeah.
So in the end, I made the hero male because he would simply have more agency. And I projected, five um, outlines of plots in different city states. But I'm kind of stuck in Rome in 1485. And the reason I'm stuck, well, I'm not stuck. I, I've got about 55,000 words into it. The mistake I made was thinking that I need to write a crime novel the way that other people write crime novels, which is, the Excel sheet, the kind of thing that Vasim Khan does, whom I know. And he does that very successfully. But he has an Excel spreadsheet and has a kind of suspects table and all these kind of things. And some of that I would use, but I'm actually a pantser at bottom. So, I was quite a long way through this book and I kind of knew or thought I knew who had ordered these murders.
Mm.
Because, if you're powerful in Renaissance Italy, you don't actually do the murdering yourself, usually. You pay somebody at some kind of hoodlum to do it for you. And then I realized quite a long way in that that person who I thought was the murderer wasn't. So, and if I'd really plotted it, I think I would have gone up, I'd have barked up the wrong tree. So that's been one of the most difficult things I've written, because I thought it was supposed to be written a particular way. And in the end, and the advice I would give to anyone is, you have to write your book the way that you write your book. Somebody else might have tips for you, but you can't actually necessarily follow what they would do, because you have to find your own way, whatever that is.
I'm so glad you said that. It also segues perfectly into my next question. But
Mhm.
I do just want to comment on it for a second, because it's really important for writers to hear that, for aspiring writers, for writers to hear that, because I think often we do get caught in that trap. It's very
Mm.
easy, especially if we're experimenting maybe with different genres, but not only, this notion that we have to be doing something some way, the right way, whatever that means. And so thank you for expressing that. And I did want to ask you, what advice would you give to aspiring writers or those working on their debut novels? What do you think? What is the advice you wish you had gotten, or what's the advice you've gotten that maybe has been most valuable to you?
The advice I would give is just do it, actually. Um, I mean, it's as simple as that, and treat it like a job.
Hmm.
So you have to get up and you have to do it every day whenever you do that. And people have different commitments. So you just, and that really has to be dedicated time, that you don't do other stuff in it. Um, but you do treat it like a job. And because when you're doing a job, there are some days that are better, much better than others. And you come home and somebody says, "Did you have a good day at the office?" And you say, "Yes, I did." And the office might be your garden shed or the spare room. But and other times it's just completely crap. But
Yeah.
you got through it, and you kind of have to get through the getting through it. And it's not a question of waiting for inspiration to strike, because guess what? It really doesn't. I mean, yes, you get the sparks, but you need to get some stuff down, and whatever works for you. I mean, if it's a particular word count or whatever, but to do what you're doing each day, and not worry about what anybody else would think about it. Not even worry too much about what you would think about it, because there are days you go out and think, "Well, that wasn't very good," but it's there, and I can revise that, because you cannot revise a blank page. And if you get stuck on stuff, go and write something else. I'm not sure that everybody would want to do that. I do it, but when I write under different names, I can be sort of a different person. So if I got stuck on whatever I was writing as Katherine Mezzacappa that was a bit more literary, then I could kind of dive off into a romance, if you like, and be Kate Zarrelli for a bit. And that does feel a bit different. And then you can come back to, the first book, and actually it's like sleeping on it. The whatever the problem was has sort of unknotted itself a bit, or it wasn't as important as you thought it was. So I think it, I wouldn't say anything more scientific than keep going. And actually, the other thing I would say is be quite ruthless with your time, ruthless with time stealers.
Hmm.
When I really started working, kind of writing seriously in about 2016, 2017, I realized I was doing some things for other people that was of benefit to them, but not particularly beneficial to me, which sounds really mean. But, if there's anywhere where you think you might be just taking a bit of a loan of, or this is a bit of a thankless task, just don't do it, because you don't get the time back. And there are certain things that I don't do, like I barely watch television,
Hmm.
barely. I mean, I probably spend a bit too much time surfing the net, but not that much. There's also the other thing about whether you manage a lot of social media, and I don't really do very much social media. And I know some authors, the better known authors that I know personally, just don't even have it at all. I mean,
It's
they
a
just don't. I mean, I was shortlisted for this prize in England, with the Historical Writers Association, and I didn't get it. as the last six. It was run by Kevin Barry,
Mm.
and Kevin Barry does no social media at all. You just won't find him. He just writes, and I
Which,
can't help thinking, fair play to him. But then he is probably better established than I am, though he's written less material. But he is so good. He's so good.
yeah,
Mm,
but that's a problem. I mean, it's a
mm.
problem because you need to be visible. All
Yeah.
need to promote themselves nowadays. Nobody's going to really do it for you. And
Mm,
social media is a real time suck.
yeah.
And, but what you said about time is such great advice because I think we do find ourselves often engaging in whatever activities and they could, and it's not mean. It's
Mm,
you have a job to do. Like if you're
yeah.
in an office and somebody's constantly wasting your time, you're like, hey,
Yeah.
I need to get this done. I have a deadline. So
Yes.
why is writing any different? If you set a deadline for yourself of however many thousand words a day and you want to get that done, you have to block out the outside world. I mean, I when I wrote my book, I was like I was in another world. I was in
Yes.
another world and I was
Yes.
working I mean, I was really, really there, but I really appreciate what you said about the good days and bad days because I think I never really thought of it that way. And that's such a healthy way to look at writing because many of us come home from the office and say, man, I earned my paycheck today. I got
Yeah.
everything done. I was
Yes.
rocking everything I did. And then there are other days where you're just like, that was a terrible day. Like nothing went the right way, whatever. But I think we're so harsh with ourselves because, these are our babies. You're putting out into the
Mm,
world something that's so personal, it's so, and so susceptible to criticism and everyone has an opinion, right? And now I think, again, if we want to go back to social media, we're just much more exposed today.
mm,
And, everyone is so much more visible. But thank you for putting it in I think, such a good way for people to look at this craft. This brings me to my last question.
mhm.
I mean, you've sort of hinted at some of the things you're working on, et cetera, but what's next for you?
I think the Julia Lama story will come up top, but this has been actually quite a difficult year, and I haven't written as much. I've not got as much in the pipeline where I'd normally want to be, and
Right.
that means that I am sort of not very easy to live with, and a bit kind of grouchy and stuff like that. So the thing about if you're meant to write, you should be writing, because if you're not, then you're going to be unhappy. End of. So that I need to get back in the groove from that point of view. But I'll work on Julia Lama. I'll work on Martina Portinari to get that novel finished and out there. I'll do something on Lucrezia Marinella. I mean, occasionally I have these completely silly ideas, and I think, yeah, that would be quite fun. If I do another Kate Zarrelli, it's going to be about an Elvis impersonator,
Oh, that
right?
I want to read. Come on.
Well, yeah,
That
because
sounds, come
but
on.
he'll be a young one, so he'll perform the early hits, so not the ones with the rhinestones and the white suit and the big
Even better.
sideburns. Yeah,
Even better.
even
Much
better. So
better. Much
he'll do,
sexier.
well, it won't be much. And you see, I've actually found that there is an annual festival of Elvis impersonators, and it's in Porthcawl in South Wales. So I think I should just go to it one
I
year. It's in
think it
September.
sounds, I think you have to go. I think you have to go. I mean, this sounds fun and everything you're working on sounds incredible. And I can't wait to read it all. I hope you'll come back to talk about whichever one comes out next. But please go to the Elvis Festival, even just because it sounds
That
exactly,
sounds fun.
exactly what
Yeah,
we all need more of these days.
yeah.
Um, and it's been delightful to talk to you. I could talk to you for hours and hours. I really am grateful to know you, and I'm thankful
And
to
likewise, Oscar.
thank you. And I'm thankful to the Florence Literary Society, which is such an incredible gift to all of us because
Oh,
it's
yeah.
right. And let's just a big shout out to them because it's such a wonderful, supportive, amazing group filled with wonderful, creative people who really
Yes.
help each other. And it's been such a revelation for me. And it's thanks to them that we met. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. Yeah, no, the Florence Lit Society is just superb, and it's our tribe, you know.
Yeah.
So, and we do need that support because people say writing can be lonely. I don't find it lonely. I mean, you meet so many people and so many interesting people and so many really supportive people,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know. So yeah, it's as you said, you know, supportive. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the events that will be in for next year, and I hope and would plan to be part of them. So
And I hope to see you at one of them, if not somewhere else,
yeah,
in the not too distant future. Thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. I've loved
it's a
this.
pleasure. Thank you.